You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Una silla de masajes puede parecer extravagante. 8 configuraciones diferentes, intensidad ajustable, además es calefaccionado. Y se siente tan bien. Sí, una silla de masajes puede parecer extravagante. Y 2, bueno, aún más. Pero cuando esas sillas de masajes vienen con un auto, se vuelven bastante prácticas. El nuevo Volkswagen Tiguan 2025 con funciones premium como los asientos delanteros con masaje disponibles. Solo parece extravagante.
Where's your playlist taking you? Down the highway? To the mountains? Or just into daydream mode while you're stuck in traffic? With over 4,000 hotels worldwide, Best Western is there to help you make the most of your getaway. Wherever that is. Because the only thing better than a great playlist is a great trip. Life's the trip. Make the most of it at Best Western. Book direct and save at bestwestern.com.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 231, The Battle of Britain Part 6, Stumbling to the End. This week, a big thank you goes out to David and Chad for the donations, and to Scott, Lukes, Mark, and The Goose is Loose for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. After the flurry of bombing raids that were executed during the first week of September, culminating in the attacks on London on September 7th, the plans for the German invasion were in an odd position. On one hand, they were as ready as they could ever possibly be, with both the army and naval components of the preparations complete, and just waiting for the finalization of the date so that they could begin their 10 days of positioning and final preparations. But it was unclear if the Luftwaffe had yet completed its goal of decisively reducing the RAF's combat abilities, and if it even could accomplish that goal given the time remaining, which by September 7th was really only a few days. To make the waters even muddier, the emerging emphasis on the bombing of London and related civilian and industrial targets made it unclear if they were still even pursuing the goal of preparing for the invasion. Bombing London's East End, while perhaps an important part of reducing the flow of sea-based goods into the capital, did basically nothing to help prepare for the invasion. On September 9th, the Luftwaffe leadership would just make things worse by fully endorsing consistent day and night bombing raids on London. An interesting entry from the diary of the Naval Operations Staff would have this to say about the naval views of the current state of the campaign after this decision was made. Quote, "The air campaign is being conducted specifically as an air offensive, without regard for the current requirements of naval warfare. The fact, therefore, remains that chances for the execution of the landing operations have remained uninfluenced by the effects of the intensified air offensive." End quote. To the British leaders, it appeared that the preparations for an invasion were continuing, with clear indications that the concentration of transport and landing craft along the coasts of France had been mostly completed by September 7th. These reconnaissance reports were supported by Enigma decrypts, which pointed to final training exercises for the landing occurring among German ground formations. The risk of a possible landing was considered to be so great that on September 7th, the code word was sent out that anti-invasion forces should be put on the highest possible alert for the next 2 weeks, due to the fact that the invasion could occur at any time. The code word was Cromwell, and if you want the background on that code word, I highly recommend the last few months of the Pax Britannica podcast by Samuel Hume, or Dr. Samuel Hume even. Check it out, it's great. The importance of this order, when looking back at history, is to emphasize that the British really did think an invasion was possible, even likely, and they were preparing for it to occur. How likely was it to occur? Well, that varied on a day-to-day basis due to the events that would occur during the second week of September. The Luftwaffe would be hampered during this week by the return of their undefeated adversary, the weather, which would reduce the ability of the German formations to complete their raids and sometimes to even find their targets. In attempts to launch another raid against London's East End on September 8th, of the German bombers that were dispatched, only 5 would actually drop their bombs on the capital due to weather conditions. Nighttime raids would be more successful. On the 9th, things would be quite a bit different though, with a large raid of almost 100 bombers moving in on London, even though the weather was not perfect. In this case, they would be met by a strong response by Fighter Command, with 11 squadrons being brought in to meet the raid, shooting down several bombers. The consequence of these raids and their overall disappointing results meant that Hitler would delay his invasion decision, which was supposed to occur on September 10th, to instead be on September 14th. This would already push the date for the invasion all the way to the 24th, dangerously late, and it would result in all of the invasion barges and boats being stuck in harbors for additional time, a risky proposition when both RAF Bomber Command and the Royal Navy were already launching sporadic attacks against those barges. Within Fighter Command, the group that the Luftwaffe was trying to destroy, after 4 days of operations, Fighter Command was already beginning to adjust to the new format of Luftwaffe operations. For the preceding weeks, the Luftwaffe had been structuring their operations so that there were a large number of smaller raids which focused on multiple targets every day. The new operational procedures seemed to be that they would remain in one large group of bombers and focus on one specific set of closely grouped targets. This change completely altered how Fighter Command could react to the raids, because previously the need to meet widely divergent raids spread Fighter Command squadrons out in ways that were quite inefficient. But now that they could almost be completely concentrated in one specific area, everything was just simpler to organize, and also allowed for the British fighters to form up in larger groups when making their attacks, which would make them more effective. Changes to Fighter Command operating procedures would be sent out on September 11th, and moving forward, 11 groups fighter squadrons would attack in pairs, or at least pairs, instead of by themselves as they had before. When possible, Spitfires would be more specifically dedicated to meeting the German fighters, where Hurricanes were supposed to focus on the bombers, which had always been the basic concept, but had not always been possible, because it was not always possible for squadrons of each of the fighter types to be present to meet earlier raids at the same time. September 11th would be another busy day as well, during which Fighter Command would have the opportunity to try out its new, more structured and prepared attacks. On the day, another 100-bomber raid with large numbers of escorting fighters would make its way for an attack on London's East End docks. They would be met by a succession of squadrons, first by 4 squadrons of 11 Group, then 3 more from 11 Group, and then finally 4 squadrons from 12 Group, all of which were equipped with Spitfires. 12 Group, under the command of Air Vice Marshal Lee Mallory, organized its squadrons slightly differently than Park's 11th Group. Lee Mallory had come to the conclusion that the dual squadron attacks, or even the 3 squadron attacks, were just too small, and that if fighters wanted to be more effective, they needed to organize into larger groups before they met with the German raiders. Lee Mallory believed that 5 squadrons was probably the proper number, a collection he referred to as a big wing. There were benefits and downsides to this approach. Obviously, more British fighters made it harder for the German fighters to properly shield the bombers from them, but at the same time, bigger wings were slower to assemble, and this made it more likely that they would not reach the bombers before they were able to drop their bombs. Park and Lee Mallory would have 2 very different views on the correct course of action, and what would begin as mild disagreements would turn into a major series of arguments later in 1940. This series of disagreements would eventually be called the Big Wing Controversy, which we'll cover in a later episode. Regardless of exactly how many squadrons were collected before they moved into attack, the British fighters were still outnumbered, and they could not prevent the German bombers from reaching their targets on September 11th. But they were able to shoot down several German bombers and Bf-110s for their efforts. The greatest cost was paid by the bomber groups as they actually were on their way back to their bases after they dropped their bombs, with multiple squadrons, including one of the Royal Canadian Air Force, making attacks. This would result in 7 bombers and 2 more Bf-110s being destroyed, which brought the total up to 10 bombers, 7 Bf-110s, and 5 109s being destroyed on this specific raid, which was around 10% of the bombers in total, which was a pretty heavy price to pay. Undeterred, Luftwaffe planners began planning for an even larger raid that was supposed to take place on the 13th, which would involve a maximum effort by Kesselring's Luftflotte. But this raid had to be delayed due to weather, so that it would not occur on the 14th. This delay then caused Hitler to once again delay his decision on Sea Lion until September 17th, which again pushed the invasion date even further. These constant delays would be the point where Sea Lion would start to be impossible, although we will save a deeper discussion on that for a future episode when we look at the entire series of events in a more focused discussion. During the period between that raid we just discussed on September 11th and September 14th, while the Luftwaffe was waiting for a good weather day to launch their major attack, which they would give the codename Valhalla, other smaller raids would continue on a variety of targets. The largest raids would continue to be on London and the surrounding districts, although there would also be some very small raids on airfields and other targets. Over London, fighter command squadrons would continue to try and meet the German bomber forces with the maximum possible number of squadrons, which often meant launching as many as 20 total fighter command squadrons against a raid, even though it rarely resulted in every single one of those making contact with the bombing raid. Oftentimes, when these fighter squadrons did not meet with the German bombing raid, it often meant that the raid was either smaller than expected or that there were no bombers at all, with the goal being to cycle the fighter squadrons as quickly as possible in case of further raids, which meant that if it was determined that there were no German bombers, sometimes they would just turn around and go home so that they could be ready if another raid came later in the day. During this 3-day period, more bombs were dropped, but they did not result in significant damage. One of the smallest raids would actually just see a handful and sometimes even one German bomber attack airfields. These small efforts were often just completely ignored by fighter command because they felt like they needed to conserve their resources and be ready to meet larger attacks. The days between 12th and the 14th were important for fighter command though, because it represented 2 days of relatively light activity, which gave them time to rest, more than they had since probably the start of August. And really, you might be able to go back all the way to the beginning of July to find days that were as easy and restful as September 12th and 13th specifically. This would leave them in a very good position to meet the Valhalla attack, which was eventually rescheduled to September 15th. While the battle was working out pretty well for the pilots of Fighter Command, the citizens of London were not having a good time after September 7th. Modern cities are a massive collection of intricate systems that, when disrupted, can cause all kinds of issues. For example, on September 10th, a German bomb would fall on northern London and damage the northern outfall sewer. This was the route through which much of London's sewage ran out of the city, and the bomb caused a containment breach which allowed sewage to run into the River Lee. The result was some very bad smells over the route of that river. And this type of damage was so bad that it would be discussed on the September 13th meeting of the War Cabinet. That's how far it went up. The result was that nothing could really be done until the damage was repaired, and that would take months. Another major issue that was faced not so much by London itself, but by the surrounding communities, was the fact that large numbers of residents from London, and specifically from the East End, would pack up and move as soon as the bombing started. They would spread in many different directions, causing serious problems for other areas of London and for towns like Reading and Windsor and Oxford, which suddenly had to try and accommodate thousands of new refugees who often brought with them very little money. Back in London, the bombing would also cause major crowding in some of the bomb shelters, particularly in basements of churches, schools, and public buildings, which had been converted to bomb shelters but suddenly found themselves overwhelmed by the number of individuals trying to utilize the space. Anytime large numbers of individuals crowded together, concerns would spread about infectious diseases and other such issues. This point in mid-September would also contain many conversations about using the tube stations as bomb shelters, which would become a more pressing topic throughout the Blitz. At least initially, there was major resistance to the idea that a bunch of people should be packed into the tube stations, due to the concern that it would disrupt traffic, and that is where the matter stood, at least for a while. It would be far from the last time that the topic would be revisited, and eventually the people of London would pretty much take matters into their own hands. It would turn out to be difficult to keep people out of a publicly available underground concrete structure when they feared aerial bombardment, because, and in this case, a lot of the people were not wrong. A lot of the tube stations made really good bomb shelters, and you couldn't deny the logic that the people were using in seeking shelter there.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. From streaming to shopping, Prime helps you get more out of your passions. So whether you're a fan of true crime or prefer a nail-biting novel from time to time, with services like Prime Video, Amazon Music, and fast free delivery, Prime makes it easy to get more out of whatever you're into or getting into. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to learn more.
The Conjuring: Last Rites. On September 5th.
Come down here, I need your help!
The Conjuring: Last Rites. Only in theaters September 5th. Rated R.
In the first half of September 1940, if you take all of the Luftwaffe's various strategic and tactical changes, the changes in focus for the campaign, and then the discussions that were occurring among the leaders and pilots, the story that you arrive at is of a military arm that was in some ways flailing in an attempt to meet its goals. There are a variety of examples that could be considered in this analysis, but I'm just going to focus on two. The transition of more Bf-109s into the fighter-bomber role, and the switch over to a focus on the bombing of the industrial and civilian targets in London that we've been discussing this episode. Episode 226 introduced the new force of Bf-109s that had been converted into a group of dedicated fighter-bombers, under the theory that they would be better able to survive their bombing operations through their speed that they possessed, particularly after they dropped their bombs, when they turned back into normal fighters. Throughout the first weeks of the Battle of Britain, they would be in constant action, attacking various targets with their low-level, high-speed attacks that had reasonable accuracy. As the losses to the medium bomber groups mounted over the course of the campaign, more Bf-109 squadrons would be converted into dedicated fighter-bomber groups. This was not completely bad in and of itself. The Bf-109 had proven to be capable of getting the job done. But it was also not a great use of the resources that the Germans had available to them. The biggest problem was that while their bomb-for-bomb accuracy was perhaps a bit better than the German medium bombers, their carrying capacity, obviously, was far lower. This meant that they were just not equipped to attack anything beyond very small, very specific targets, but during September and October, they would begin to be used against targets in London. In large cities like London, it was harder to find and hit targets. But importantly, there was also far more involved in expanding the number of 109 bombers than just converting some aircraft to carry bombs. Because one of the major reasons that the first groups were so successful is because the pilots had been hand-picked and had went through extensive training. It was only through this experience and this training that they were able to maintain their high bombing accuracy. As the numbers expanded, more pilots of lesser skill were brought in, and they were provided with less training, which meant a higher percentage of bombs being dropped off target. It did not help that when bombing population centers like London, the 109s had to fly higher than they wanted to due to the volume of anti-aircraft fire from the anti-aircraft guns that the British had positioned in the city. All of this is before even considering the fact that the 109 fighter squadrons were already being pushed to the limits of their endurance to meet the demands of bomber escort missions, and suddenly there were, countless less 109s available for bomber protection. The second major change made by the Luftwaffe, that we've already discussed, was the changeover from the very targeted strikes on RAF targets to a more general and at times, civilian set of targets in and around London. This change gets a lot of criticism in the histories, but also would have gotten a lot of criticism from the pre-war German Luftwaffe. In the years before the war, the Luftwaffe had specifically dismissed the idea of terror bombing cities because at the time they believed that the results were not predictable. This is because there were concerns about exactly what would happen in a city like London over the course of a bombing campaign, because there was a risk that instead of destroying civilian morale, the bombing raids would serve as a unifying event and one that hardened the resolve of some of the citizens to continue to fight. There were also concerns that it would not drastically derail the war activities of a city as large as something like London, because there just weren't enough bombs that could be dropped. However, when the decision was put before Goering, Hitler, and the other German leaders, they specifically ignored these pre-war ideas and conclusions as they shifted bombing into London. While the German leaders were shifting how the bombing campaign was being organized in big and small ways, at the front the German pilots were simply wearing down. On the bomber side, as losses grew, morale dropped, as often happened with any military unit. This was compounded by the fact that unlike the Allied bombing campaigns of later years, there was no real concept of a tour of duty for the Luftwaffe at this point in the war. For example, one bomber pilot, Hajo Hermann, would fly 90 combat missions between the start of the war and the middle of October 1940, with almost a third of those flown against London in September and October. The feelings among the fighter pilots were more complicated. The same level of exhaustion was there, both from the number of sorties that were being flown as well as the losses. As one pilot, Ulrich Steinhilper, would write that the exhaustion, quote, comes with living under constant threat. We would feel the relief of returning to base, but would then have to cope with the emotions of having lost friends and colleagues, knowing also that within minutes we would have to do it all over again, end quote. This was compounded by the fact that many fighter pilots knew that their own performance was being hindered, and their risk of death was being increased by the need to provide close support for the bombers. They knew that having to fly lower and slower to protect the bombers was costing the fighter groups both aircraft and pilots, but they were being forced to do so to try and reduce bomber losses. It seemed clear which group of pilots were being favored in Luftwaffe tactics, and it did not seem to be the pilots in their 109s. All of these challenges compounded to crush morale with a variety of effects. There was a rise in the number of instances of German fighter pilots turning around from their missions, claiming some sort of vague mechanical issue with their aircraft. Engine issues were quite common. However, upon landing, no issues would be found. And it was not just happening to new pilots, but also far more experienced veterans, even those that had been flying since the Spanish Civil War days. When noting one of these instances, Ulrich, who I quoted above, would chalk it up primarily to the tempo of operations. Quote, it seemed you could just wear out like any other machine. And that is where things were going wrong. We just weren't getting a break, end quote. As morale fell, the number of complaints and other issues increased, particularly as the campaign, which was supposed to be a quick and easy win, instead transitioned into a long slog that was clearly not progressing completely in favor of the Luftwaffe. Even the British pilots were feeling the strain of long-term combat operations by the middle of September, and they in some ways had it easier than the Luftwaffe pilots. On a positive side for fighter command pilots, they were at least not operating constantly on the very edge of their operational range like the 109 pilots, and they were not constantly burning time and energy flying across the channel from France. The downsides for the British pilots was that they did not know exactly when a raid was going to happen, which resulted in long periods of waiting and low-level anxiety in anticipation of the next order to scramble to meet an incoming German formation. As one pilot, B. Beaumont, would say, quote, there was a lot of tension in sitting around in dispersal. You jumped a foot when the telephone went. Fighting was tiring. It was all cumulative. The weeks went by and the pressure never stopped, and then there was a loss of your colleagues, end quote. But there would still be times when the pilots could unwind. A critical part of maintaining combat readiness over weeks and months was that unwinding. A B would go on to say, quote, if you'd been fighting during the day and you'd gone off down to the pub with the lads at night and then had a little bit more than you should have, by 4 o'clock in the morning when you were woken up, you probably had a bit of a hangover. And as soon as you got to dispersal, you'd find a bed and lie down and go to sleep till somebody woke you up, end quote. Obviously, getting completely drunk and still being drunk when you were going down the runway for takeoff was not optimal, but dwelling on the stress and anxiety had its own issues. Experience was also important, and the worst loss rates were always among the newest pilots. Veteran pilots like Pete Brothers would claim that much of this was down to simply knowing the aircraft in a more intimate way and not having to really think about what the aircraft could or should do when under attack, and instead just doing it. The growing number of inexperienced pilots on both sides would be a problem during the later stages of the fighting in September, as the rate at which new blood entered the fighting would outpace the rate at which those same pilots were gaining the needed experience to survive, which just put more pressure on the experienced pilots, and very exhausted experienced pilots, to take up the slack. Aircraft issues also made this worse, because if there was a mechanical issue with a Spitfire, a Hurricane, a 109, any aircraft, it was often not the veteran pilots that would stay behind. It was the newest. And those extra sorties on those veteran pilots were adding up as day after day and week after week went by. But all of these problems, the exhaustion, the anxiety, none of it would prevent Operation Valhalla and Fighter Command's response to it. The operation was now scheduled for September 15th, 1940, a date which is now known as Battle of Britain Day.